Welcome to the Praxis Report. We're the podcast where theory meets practice and where politics and current events are dissected through a revolutionary perspective. I'm your host, Jonathan Brown.
And I'm your co-host, William Barth.
Join us today in an exciting conversation about the Israeli genocide in Gaza. A remarkable development just occurred. Israel, after almost 2 years of genocide and absolute carnage that it inflicted upon Gaza, Israel has now, by all reports, agreed upon a ceasefire to end its hostilities against the Gaza Strip. So the remarkable thing about this is that the Trump administration was essential for pushing the ceasefire through. Will, what do you make of this development?
Yeah, it's not so much remarkable, but again, continuing from our prior podcast analysis and conversations about this, is again, it's this idea of making peace and the peace mantle sort of the crown jewel or the centerpiece of any credible strategy to achieve progressive political change. Yeah. And somehow Donald Trump, to his credit, has picked up on this. Maybe it's a result of his own personal history with, growing up in New York and with the Vietnam War, and knowing that war in some Republican circles was always sort of unpopular because war was always thought to be bad for business. And so you had the emergence of sort of Trump's mentors like Richard Nixon, who tried to end the Cold War with the Soviet Union and with communist China, or what they used to call Red China. That's the People's Republic of China. They defined it racially, and it shows you how racist it was. And in any event, Nixon also got elected in 1968 with what he called a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam, which was actually an obnoxious plan that just really elevated the bombing campaign against Vietnam and Cambodia and led to God knows how many countless more mass murder deaths and napalming of that beautiful country. But nonetheless, Republicans saw the virtue of this peace issue and picked up on it. And Trump has done that. And so far, he's making good on it. Whether it continues, that's another question. But he is making good on it. And if he ends this war in Ukraine somehow, then he'll not only earn himself a Nobel Peace Prize, but he will cement his political popularity. And the Democrats, my God, they should be ashamed of themselves. They have completely obliterated and marginalized the anti-war movement and the so-called Lyndon Johnson wing of the party, the pro-war wing, the pro-military industrial complex, pro-Cold War wing has won out. And that is the main reason the Democrats are now marginalized and lost this election.
That's a great time to bring up the terms of the ceasefire. I think.
Yeah, I was going to ask you to do that, John. If you could do that.
Here's an article from the Times of Israel, which is a sort of mainstream Israeli news site. And what we can see here is that, according to Arab officials, Trump swayed Netanyahu in one meeting than the Biden administration did all year. And so we have here President Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, who showed up in Jerusalem
on Sabbath,
on Shabbat, on Shabbos. And Israel, Netanyahu's cabinet tried to say, we can't talk to you right now. It's Shabbat. It's the Sabbath. We can't talk. And Trump's guy basically told them, I don't give a fuck if it's the Sabbath. We're talking right now. And we're going to end this.
He basically said, you can go back to your Sabbath after you make a peace deal. Exactly. But right now we're going to stop the mass murder. That's what we're going to do on Sabbath. We're going to stop the murder, and then you can go back to praying. But for right now, you're going to stop murdering people. You got to hand it. You got to hand it to them.
It's amazing, and the terms of the peace ceasefire were essentially no different than what had been on the table for over a year that Hamas had already agreed to. But Israel was the one who had refused, and the Biden administration, of course, enabled and supported and armed Israel to continue its mass murder and carnage for another year. But when Trump came into office, he pressured Israel and Netanyahu and said, when I get into office, y'all need to wrap this up now. And Trump, compares himself to the deal maker. What is his famous book, The Art of the Deal?
The Art of the Deal.
He likes to think of himself that he can sit down and force anybody to come to an agreement. And by putting this pressure onto Israel, actually surprisingly forced them to accept this ceasefire. And people have been saying, some other pundits like Glenn Greenwald, for example, has spoken about the fact that there's a contradiction in the Trump America First argument, that Trump's people are surrounded by a lot of Zionists. The Adelson family
funded by
yes. The Adelsons have given billions of dollars to Trump's campaign, and he has people like Elon Musk, who is also a very strong Zionist, and yet Trump has been able to sort of force Netanyahu to come to an agreement. As far as the terms, the hostages, there's going to be an exchange. The Palestinian hostages that are illegally detained in Israel will be released through various phases. And Israel is supposedly going to have to withdraw military from Gaza. However, one thing I've noticed looking at the deal, Israel is allowed to still maintain a military presence. They are going to have a 700-meter zone within the border fence around certain sections of Gaza, and a military presence on the border with Egypt in Gaza. So the irony here is that this exposes the fact that Gaza is still under Israeli control and occupation and military surveillance. But Israel's terms of the ceasefire are still going to allow Israel to maintain a presence in Gaza. But the remarkable thing, at least from the perspective of humanitarianism, is that Israel will at least hopefully cease some of its bombardment of the Gaza civilian population, at least for the time being. Because one thing we know historically is that anytime Israel has agreed to a ceasefire, they inevitably will violate the ceasefire. With Lebanon, when they agree to a ceasefire with Hezbollah, they typically will, before the ceasefire goes into effect, they will bombard the people as much and kill as many people as they can before the ceasefire. And then even after the ceasefire, they'll continue to drop bombs here and there. And so Israel is historically terrible at keeping hold of its ceasefires. So we can't expect this to be considered a victory in terms of a long-term end to the conflict, because it's not. It's not an end to the Palestine question. It's not an end to the violence and the genocide. It's sort of saying, let's put a timeout on it. Israel has done almost 2 years worth of mass murder, and that has rendered the Gaza Strip virtually uninhabitable. And now they're saying, all right, time out. We've reached the limit of what world opinion and U.S. opinion will allow us to get away with, and so they're going to have to pull back a little bit. But the next step is, what do we do from here? Because the Gaza Strip is completely destroyed, and 90% of the population is homeless and displaced, living in tents and refugee camps. There's mass starvation. There's disease that is rampant. And I believe the vast majority of the infrastructure, the homes, apartments, schools, hospitals, churches, and mosques are completely destroyed. There's rubble everywhere that would take decades to clear out and billions of dollars to rebuild.
Yes.
So what is left of Gaza and its people? That is the ultimate question. And where do we go from here?
Right. Yes, that's the question. John, hearing you talk, I mean, I'm just reflecting. Um, you talk about Gaza the way the press talks about Gaza, and not you personally, but talking about it as a war with Gaza, and the way the press frames the issue as some kind of a conflict with Gaza, as if Gaza is some kind of independent country that attacked Israel, and Israel defended itself against Gaza in this war between Gaza and Israel, two countries at war with one another. And this goes to the question at hand, which is what we're really witnessing here is what you might call the birth pangs of a new nation, and that we always have to remind ourselves that there is no war between states. Israel is not at war with Gaza. Gaza is a territory.
Can you explain to the audience?
Yeah. So what we mean by that is that usually when we define war as a conflict between two sovereign UN member states. There are 193 sovereign independent UN member states. In other words, 193 countries. This is our world system, and this is how we define a country. What is a country? A country is when the United Nations gets together and decides that a people's, a minority group, an indigenous group, a national group like Arab Israelis that are now in the current day call themselves Palestinians, are entitled to self-determination. And if that group decides that it wants its own country, they can sort of apply to the United Nations, and the United Nations can say to them, yes, you're a peoples and you're entitled to self-determination, which means you're entitled, if you want it, to create a state. This is another sort of side issue. We're not quite so sure what the Palestinians want or what the Palestinian masses want to do. Do they want to remain in Israel and become Israeli citizens and just sort of take over the country? Because there's more Arab Israeli Palestinians living in these territories, including Israel, than there are Jews. So they might want to take that approach. The way the Inuit people, the so-called Eskimos back in the day, the Inuit created Nunavik, a state in Canada, because they have the right to self-determination with their own language, their own practices, cultural practices, and so forth. But they wanted to remain Canadians. At one point, Arab Israelis or Palestinians had that option. Perhaps we have our own Palestinian state within a greater Israel, or vice versa. Maybe Israel needs to be a sort of autonomous region or Jewish homeland within Palestine, which was the original idea. The point I'm trying to make is this. Creating a new country is not a democratic process. Historically, wherever new countries are created, over the past 100 years, wherever you are in the world, whether you're in Africa or the Arab territories, the Middle East, or Latin America or Asia, new states were created not democratically. They're created through violence, through violent resistance. Look at Africa. Look at the colonialized African states of former white Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. Violent revolution created that state. Violence created South Africa, the current day South Africa, putting an end to apartheid. Violence created what we call Kenya today. In fact, some of the early Zionist congresses, when the Jews were trying to decide where they should move, they were looking at Eldoret, Kenya. I know that because I'm a long distance runner, and that's where all the great marathoners come from.
Right.
But anyway, they were looking at that. The point I'm making is this. States are created through violence because, pardon me, our international system, the United Nations, has no legal procedure to create a new country. The only way you can create a new country is by challenging a current member of the United Nations and saying, part of your territory should come to us and we want a state out of it. That's how the Ireland was created in the United Kingdom. And look at the endless violence that was necessary in order to create an independent Ireland in the United Kingdom. So this is a problem of state creation and a problem throughout our entire international system. In other words, you can't just start a petition, go to the UN and say, hey, we'd like to have a country. And you post a bond of a $5 billion and then you get a country out of it. There's only one way you get a country. You got to start murdering people. You got to turn to self-help. And if you murder enough people, they'll give you a country. In other words, self-help. There's no legal procedure to create a country, and no country, Israel is no different, is going to say to the Palestinian masses, almost 7.5 million Arab Israelis who live in Israel, if you include Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza. They're not going to say, oh, sure, take half the country, we'll split it in half and we'll give you an independent Palestine. No way they're going to do it. But it's a conundrum for the Israelis, because if they don't do it, and they haven't up to now, in fact, and to my Jewish brothers and sisters and friends, the position of Israel, the position of the Jewish people is that the Palestinians will never, ever have a state. And if you want to call me an anti-Semitic or self-hating Jew because I support Palestinian human rights and Palestinian statehood, look at yourself. The other four fingers are pointing at yourself, because the formal position of the Jewish people as represented by the current Israeli regime is there will never be a Palestinian state. Never, ever. Which means that Israel is and will continue to be a majority ethnic Arab state, a majority ethnic Arab state that is controlled by a minority group called the Jewish people. And I don't know how Israel is going to solve it. If you look at the basic law of Israel, no one in Israel has a right to self-determination unless you're Jewish. If you're Arab, you have no right to self-determination in Israel. In fact, if you're an Arab Israeli Palestinian living in Gaza or the West Bank or Jerusalem, you have no voting rights. You have no rights to travel. You have no human rights. And as you can see, what's happening is that you even are being subjugated to the point of genocide, mass murder, just the mass murder. By the way, John, you have that article, the Lancet article. I don't know if we can post it, but Lancet, the British medical journal.
Hold on, let me pull that up. Let me pull that up.
Let's look at that.
Let's pull that up.
As now, Lancet is reporting that as many as well over 180,000 Palestinians,
186,000, according to
186,000 Gazans, or I don't know if it's just Gazans or Palestinians, broadly speaking, including the West Bank, are now dead. So what this is doing is it is helping Jews return to becoming the majority population, because the two populations, both Arab and Jewish, were roughly equivalent. Arabs have the advantage. Arabs are the majority of Israel. But if you include Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem, and even most my Jewish friends would have to admit, come on, Jerusalem's a part of Israel. No Jewish community person or representative of the Jewish community would argue Jerusalem's not part of Israel. So if you count all the ethnic...
Let's consider what this study is saying for our audience, because the official death toll that the Gaza Health Ministry puts out is that it's somewhere in the 40-something thousand range.
That's the number bandied about by the conventional press, and
right, and that's a number that they have been able to officially confirm that, someone who they found was killed directly, that they can track a death certificate and things like that. What the Lancet researchers did in this medical journal was they looked at a more holistic approach where they study indirect deaths through starvation, through disease,
disease,
through people who were denied electricity or people who died in a hospital when Israel cut off hospitals or cut off food and water. And also just the sheer magnitude of people who are still buried under the rubble who cannot be accounted for, that are not put in the official death statistics. So this number would show 186,000 out of a population of 2 million have been killed in the last year and a half by Israel.
Yeah, it's just
remarkable.
Shocks the moral conscience.
So I want to
shocks
get
the
back to
moral
what you were saying,
conscience.
though, because what we were talking about,
So
Israel is not
the point I'm trying to make is,
well, if I could say this,
the
like
point I'm trying to,
you were saying that Israel is not at war with a sovereign state because, in your view,
correct.
Gaza is not a sovereign member state. Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza or East Jerusalem, Palestine is not yet a sovereign state. So when Israel says we were attacked on October 7th, we were attacked. Hamas attacked us. The question no one's asking is, well, is Gaza a sovereign, independent state that is separate from Israel, or is Gaza a territory that is administered by, occupied by, and under the sovereignty of the state of Israel itself?
Of the state of Israel, which would make the conflict quite different. Quite different. It would be like saying, America was back in this 1960s. America was attacked when Watts. I come from Los Angeles. When Watts exploded, when African Americans in the Watts community rioted and burned and looted, protesting the segregated conditions of Black Americans, not only in Watts, but in Cleveland and in Detroit and Harlem, all throughout the country. The so-called long, hot summers. America was attacked, and America's at war. At war with who? With Americans? With African Americans? That's what it's like, analogizing it to. In other words, what we're talking about here, and this is my point, and I'm just going to put it out there. Israel is at civil war with itself. Israel is a multicultural state. Israel is a state with a majority Arab population and a very large Jewish population. And those two populations, particularly the Jewish population, is not only going to have to recognize that, but decide what kind of structure both peoples are going to create that are going to allow them to live together or destroy each other. What was it that Martin Luther King Jr. It's Martin Luther King Day tomorrow. What was it that he said? He said, "Well, we may have all come here on different ships. The Puritans or the African American slaves. We all arrived in the United States on different ships, but we are all in the same boat now. Arabs and Jews are living together in the same boat, and they're going to have to figure it out. And none of these peace deals and negotiations, endless negotiations on terms and conditions. And this is the way these kind of negotiations usually go. It's like a dance. First you say you do, then you say you don't, then you say you will, then you say you won't. And it's sort of this endless dance until the two sides realize that there's only one solution, which is we're either going to destroy each other or we're going to rise up together. What was it that King used to say? We'll either rise up together as brothers and sisters or perish as fools. And so that's the challenge here. It's not any particular peace deal or it's whether or not there is going to be a Palestine, whether we're going to recognize a Palestinian state. And also, and this is what you and I can discuss, John, is what is the future of Israel in light of a Palestinian state? Do we have a binational state? Do we have two separate states? Or do we have a singular entity with both peoples living in it? And how can they live to protect their cultural existence and identity? Or do we just have genocide and one group tries to destroy the other? But I don't mean to apply equality. I don't ever mean to imply that there's an equilibrium between Arabs and Jews. Jews are subjugating the Arab masses and indigenous Arab population of Palestine. That is clear. And the question is now, how do we resolve it? No one has addressed that question up to now. And that is going to be the question of the future. And just no other way
I think the big question for me that we have to, the big piece that we have to analyze is the fact that the state of Israel and Zionism is sort of unique, in my opinion, compared to other national movements, because the Jewish population of Palestine is not an indigenous population to that territory. Jews are a diasporic people. We live amongst the world, scattered throughout the nations of the world. And Israel was created by the Western colonial imperialist powers. First, in 1917, it was the British Empire with the Balfour Declaration. Then it was in 1948, the United States, and etc., that agreed to give a piece of the Palestinian territory to European Jews who were displaced because of not just the Holocaust, but centuries of European Christian anti-Semitism. So in my view,
unprecedented persecution.
Unprecedented persecution. But in my view, Israel represents a foreign imposition upon the Middle East. It is not an organic nation that formed out of the Middle East. It is that the Europeans wanted to resolve what they called the Jewish question, which in modern times, how do we integrate the Jewish populations into the countries in Europe? And Hitler's solution to the Jewish question was we kill them, genocide. But the Zionist solution was we take the Jews out of Europe. Jews can't live in Europe. We send them to Palestine. And that solution was European imperialist powers letting themselves off the hook and saying, we're not going to integrate Jews into our countries as equals peoples and have them self-determination and human rights and cultural autonomy and freedom within European countries. We're going to take them out of Europe and impose them upon the Middle East. And in doing so, the Western countries had a vassal state, a client state, that they could use to fill with armaments and weapons. And in recent months, Robert Kennedy said, Israel is a bulwark for us. It's a giant aircraft carrier. We can sell all our weapons to it, and they do the dirty work, and they break up the Arab world, and they fight against the Palestinians and the Lebanese and Iran. And Biden himself said, Israel's the best investment we've ever made. If Israel didn't exist, we'd have to create our own Israel. So it's a way for the Western countries to have a little client state in that part of the world to shore up American control and control over the oil supplies, control over the Arab nationalist territories, and for America to maintain hegemony. So Israel, to me, is not a national country that's a normal nation. It's a foreign imposition that's part of Western colonial imperialist relations. And as long as Israel exists as an imperialist imposition, it will never find peace with its Palestinian and with Arab world broadly. So it has to somehow be decolonized or de-Zionized, and the Jewish population has to be integrated in an organic way into the Middle East, rather than it being this imposition upon the Middle East that is kept there through military force alone.
Do you think that the Jewish population of Palestine or the Jewish population of Israel has to be, do you think that Israel has to be denationalized?
The state of Israel as it currently exists, I think, as a so-called Jewish state that has sovereignty not for all of the citizens that live there, but just for the Jews only, I think that would have to be denationalized. I think in the future of Palestine, you can have Jews, Christians, Muslims, Arabs, every ethnic group, and religious group should have their own cultural rights respected and religious rights respected. But I think the idea of a, ethnic or religious supremacy, I don't think that's an idea that can really be sustained.
I mean, in terms of human rights, I mean, the idea of an ethno-racial group or an ethno-racial religious group having autonomy and self-determination and having their culture protected, their cultural existence protected, is a common method of providing liberation for historically subjugated groups. So so there are ways to do this. In other words, for the Jewish population to have its cultural rights and its cultural existence and identity not only protected but perpetuated in a manner that is consistent with human rights. That is certainly possible. I pose these questions to you because I think most authors don't really get into the weeds of this particular question. Well, then what is to be done? What do you do with the Jewish population? Do you simply coercively assimilate them and say you all got to speak Arabic now and become join the Muslim religion, or do or you can keep your Jewish religion but you got to speak Arabic, or you got to give up your flag? Oftentimes, flags are the big cutting edge issue. Like, what flag are we going to have? But I really do think my proposal was I don't like calling it binational, but two autonomous nations, an Israel nation and a Palestinian nation, as part of a commonwealth in the Middle East. And I think both could have equal rights and full rights of return within a context where both groups would live in this is sort of a liberal approach, in an atmosphere of respect and equality. But given what has happened, given the genocide that's taking place in Gaza, now I don't know if that's possible. In other words, if a liberal sort of solution is possible there.
Yeah, I don't know about that either. I think ultimately, whether they have what you call it, a commonwealth, or what sort of arrangement politically is there, I think, to me, that's a secondary question to the underlying material relationship to imperialism that Israel serves. I think that when I say that we need to de-Zionize the state of Israel, what I think of is we have to sever the tie between Israeli Jewry and the Western imperialist powers. Because if you really are going to go back to this idea of national self-determination, you have to ask, do Jews have self-determination if we are serving the interest of Western imperialism? Because I would say Jews do not then. Jews are then like kind of pawns of imperialist control in the Middle East.
Yeah,
and so Israel is not a sovereign state in that sense of being self-determined. It is a state whose self-determination, so-called, depends on it being tied to this Western imperialist world order. So I think that's the relationship that has to be broken. The imperialist
right
of the Middle East,
which I'm no expert on Zionism by any means. I don't like getting into the issue because it's Zionism is a theoretical sort of issue, and I'm not good at political theory to that extent. But you're much better than I. If you look at some of the history I know of the Zionist movement in Europe, you had Zionists calling for Jewish statehood and self-determination, for example, in Russia, with Yiddish being the Jewish national language. The Yiddish was the language of European Jewry.
But that was just a quick correction. That was not the Zionist movement. That was the Labor Bund.
The London Labor Bund, yes. Right?
The Bundists were a Marxist group that opposed Zionism, that argued
okay.
Yes.
All right.
They thought that Jews should be a part of international socialism, but that there should be a cultural and linguistic Yiddish sort of autonomy for Jews in the countries of Europe in which they lived.
Or in a country. I think it was the Soviet Union where they were basing the new state, the Judenstand, or the new state. By the way, I think that would have been the solution to the Jewish question, by the way, without question. And by the way, under the European Convention on Minority Languages, Yiddish, the Jewish language of Yiddish, is a legally protected language in Europe, along with Romani, which is the language of the Roma peoples of Europe. These are two terribly persecuted groups in Europe. Whereas in the state of Israel, Yiddish, which is the language of European Jewry, is not recognized as an official is not even recognized as a Jewish language, because it's associated with what the Zionists call this diaspora. That is, that Jews were, kicked out of their homeland back in the ancient times of Israel or Palestine or whatever it was called then, and was Judea, and was they went on a diaspora where Jews were a minority everywhere and a majority nowhere. So the Zionist idea was, well, Jews need to return to some kind of national idea where they are the majority and can have their own state the way other groups do. One other correction I wanted to make, John, there always were, from the time of antiquity or the times of Christ, there were small numbers of Jews who always were in Palestine. So, I mean, it was chosen, yeah, obviously for biblical reasons and ideological reasons, to make Palestine the sort of homeland of Jewry, but there were small numbers of Jews who remained there since antiquity, before the diaspora, and so there was always an indigenous Jewish population there, although admittedly a micro population, small in number. But I don't think that defeats the argument you're making.
Well, the Jewish
but it is the argument that Jews make.
Yeah, I mean, the Jewish population of Palestine was a minority. It was smaller than the Muslim and Christian population. And the difference is that there were Jews living in Jerusalem, for example, for centuries, but they were not seeking to build Jewish sovereign statehood in that territory.
Right.
Because for thousands of years, the belief among Jews religiously was that Jews are in galut, which is exile in Hebrew. That Jews were in exile, and until the Messiah comes, till the Messianic age, the end of times, if you will, then the kingdom of Jerusalem will be restored, and God will put Jews back with their kingdom. But the idea that Jews should go to Palestine with guns and expel the non-Jewish population and build a state was rejected at the time by religious Jews. It was rejected by socialist Jews. It was rejected by everyone. And the Zionist movement was a fringe group in the Jewish population who wanted to get rid of the diaspora, or negate the diaspora as they called it, by imposing a political sovereignty of Jewish statehood onto Palestine. And that's why I always talk about Zionism, because I think I'm the kind of Jew that even if the Palestinians weren't there, if the land really was an empty land and there was no people there, I would still be against Zionism, because I do not think that I accept that my culture and identity has to be tied to a national project that is militaristic and is rooted in conquering land and territory. I think that it makes it so that Jews can no longer live as normal people in the rest of the world. Because if I'm here in Georgia, you're in Los Angeles, but we're not supposed to believe that America is actually our country. We're supposed to believe that Israel, this country that we're not from, that we never were born there, and my family came over to the United States from Europe. So because our biblical ancestors were there 3,000 years ago, Zionists want us to believe that that is our actual home, not the country where we are currently living. So to me, I would reject Zionism. Not, of course, for the Palestinians, I reject it, but even as a Jew, just purely for Jewish reasons alone, I would reject it as well.
Right. But it's one thing we can be certain is that the application of this theory, Zionism, is applied in a way that subjugates the indigenous population of Palestine, and has created this sort of really horrific situation that's just it's almost unimaginable and hard to understand. Well, especially as a Jew and as a member of a persecuted peoples. I mean, again, the persecution of Jewry in Europe is also difficult to understand. You have to remember that Europe was once Christendom, and the existence of a Jew, in a sense, called into question and validated the whole Christian idea. If Jews existed, it meant that simply the Christian deity, the Lord Jesus Christ, was not the Lord and not the Son of God. And the existence of the Jew it challenged the central theological idea of Christianity. And so the Jew had to be persecuted or destroyed or obliterated or annihilated. And that's the basis of hundreds of centuries, or not over 1,000 years of persecution in Europe. So obviously Jewry had to do something. And unfortunately, this was the result, which we went from, I would say out of the frying pan into the fire. I mean, this is what's going on now is even worse in a sense that in some ways than
well, it's the persecution. It's the term that I would use is a Holocaust inversion, because what I understand it is that the going from this how do you make sense of what you're saying? Like going from being a oppressed group to becoming oppressors of other people. How do you go from being a victim of genocide to a perpetrator of genocide? And that is the remarkable transformation that has happened to the Jewish people in the last century.
Yes, and that's what we have to challenge. That's the challenge right there.
Well, and that's speaking of the praxis, the praxis of Zionism. For any claim that Zionists make that they are about self-determination for the Jews and giving Jews a refuge from persecution, but the practical application of Zionism has been to turn Jews into perpetrators of genocide. And so just as the Nazis, and before the Nazis for thousands of years, the European Christendom had persecuted Jewry, now Jews have our own military, our own state, and we were using that military to commit mass murder against the Palestinians. And if you look at it psychologically, the Israeli Jewish society is mentally ill. They are a very sociopath.
That's a social pathology.
It's a very extreme social pathology. I mean, one example of this is the Israeli soldiers in Gaza will post videos onto their social media of them blowing up civilian homes, bombing people, killing people, and they'll
torturing and raping and engaging in incredible crimes against humanity.
Crimes against humanity while they are cheering and celebrating and
laughing at it, the way Nazis would in Germany.
Right, and that's a very difficult thing as a Jew to understand that our ancestors who had gone through such unspeakable horrors by the Nazis, by the pogroms and the expulsions and all of these crimes, then we are now expelling people. Now we're bombing people and carpet bombing them.
Yeah, I always, in my own naive way, I always thought that simply the idea of a homeland in Palestine would mean that there was sort of a refuge, in a sense, a refuge, like a refuge from genocide, for genocide victims. They didn't even have to be exclusively Jewish victims of genocide. Could be, what is it in Serbia, the Muslims of Serbia who were victimized by genocide, or the Tutsis who were victimized by the Hutus of Rwanda of genocide. That somehow Israel could be sort of a haven for the genocide victim, for Jews, because Jews needed one, but for other victims of genocide. And I always thought that should be its basic sort of purpose, and that one could certainly envision a state constructed based on the fundamental principles of human rights, that includes protections against genocide and racism and other forms of subjugation, and also that protects cultural rights, that allows groups, regardless of their language or their religion or their race, to perpetuate themselves. In other words, not just be protected against discrimination, but allows the group to practice its language, practice its religion, cultivate it, perpetuate, if you will, develop their culture and their cultural identity, but not in a way that I mean, to say that you can do that in a way that subjugates another group and prevents that group from doing it is a violation of human rights. In other words,
Yeah, absolutely.
you can't have human rights for Jews and then subjugate the ethnic Arab population of that same territory.
A contradiction.
That's not human rights. In other words, that's a violation of human rights. So it really is a conundrum and a quandary as to how you now resolve this contradiction, if you will.
Well, I think what you're getting at here is there are two different definitions of genocide that goes on. So one group of people like us, you and I, would say that the Holocaust was a part of a larger picture of different other oppression, genocide, mass murder. That it is one piece that we can connect the Jewish oppression to the oppression that other groups had faced. But the Zionists take the Holocaust and they put it up on a pedestal. And Norman Finkelstein, the historian, has written, he calls it the Holocaust industry.
The Holocaust industry,
where
yes.
they take the Holocaust and they say, the Holocaust is unspeakable, unimaginable. No crime in the history of humanity is ever on the same plane as the Holocaust. You can't compare any other form of suffering to the suffering of the Jews. The Jews have a monopoly on suffering. So in the eyes of Zionists, they are perpetual, inherently victims, no matter what. They are always the victims, always the victims, always the victims. Even while they're committing murder and genocide against Palestinians, they're still the victims, perpetual victims, because the Holocaust is on this high plane of existence. So they refuse to connect their struggle, the Jewish struggle, to the suffering of other people. And I think that's a psychological problem that Zionism has created in the Israeli population.
Yeah, that's the social pathology of Israel, of Israelis.
Yes.
Broadly speaking.
Broadly speaking, and the one thing we can say moving forward is that because the extreme and brutal nature of this latest round of genocide in Gaza, it's been laid bare for the whole world to see. And Israel is, I believe, losing its moral and political legitimacy in the eyes of most people around the world like never before in its history.
No question about it. No question about that. So maybe we can try to somehow take this rather erudite discussion and try to provide some practical way forward.
I think in my view, we're American Jews. We live in the United States. So our practical solution is, in my view, finding a way to end the American relationship with Israel, so that because Israel has its protection from the United States, its funding, its arming, its backing diplomatically by the United States, that is what enables Israel to carry on as it does. So our strategy should be finding a way to sever that U.S.-Israel special relationship and to give Israel no longer the green light to do whatever it wants to the Palestinians.
But what is the path forward, though, for Israelis and Palestinians together to resolve this this conundrum, this boat that these 15 million residents live in, called Israel, or call it Palestine, or call it whatever you want? What do you do?
Well, I think you already said the solution there. I mean, you have a multicultural state that provides human rights and culture for Jews and Muslims and Christians and Arabs and everyone having, their own cultural expression. I think a multicultural, multi-ethnic state is the reality. It's already a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state.
It is.
So that would be what if everyone is going to still live there, you have to find you have to live as a multicultural state with respect for everyone's rights. But as far as we're not Israelis, we're not Palestinians, we don't live there.
That's right.
So our question, I think, is to push the American people to continue to challenge our leaders and our government to call into question, why does America unconditionally back Israel? Why is Israel not challenged by our media, by our leaders? And I think that's what we can practically do here in the United States.
I think I would I think I would add to that the two parties here, Arab Israelis, Jewish Israelis, or Palestinians and Israelis, do not seem capable in and of themselves of resolving their conflict. And so there needs to be a sort of a broader entity or body, as you suggest, not the United States, clearly, giving your sort of analyzation, but some kind of international supervision that sort of helps create a resolution between the parties here, and I think that's very much needed. I think in the we don't really have an international system that's as strong as we would like it. But we do have international and regional organizations like the League of Arab States, like the United Nations, and these bodies can and should be used to compel these two warring groups, particularly also to stop this genocide from taking place. From the beginning of the conflict, I called for the stationing of United Nations Blue Helmet peacekeepers. They call it "Send in the Blues." To be stationed in Israel, not under Israeli command, but under United Nations command, to stop not only the genocide that's taking place by the IDF against the indigenous inhabitants of Gaza, but also to protect Jews against terrorism from any terrorist groups or in Israel. In other words, peacekeepers that can stop the violence, full stop, on all sides. There needs to be that, but I would also say that, and this would be my one addition to the idea of just a multicultural democratic state. Jews can have their sort of self-determination in a way that's consistent with human rights. To say that we are capable of this, and this should be done, and the same for Palestinians. They can have their self-determination in a way that's consistent with human rights. I would hope that both peoples could achieve that. But again, human rights is a liberal construct. I'm not necessarily incorporating your analysis of imperialism into that remedy suggestion, but because international law is liberal in nature, it has a liberal character. But I still think that it's our it seems to be our best shot at civilization.
Right, but this gets us to the practical application of international law. Like Vladimir Putin always makes a great point. The rules-based international order that is led by the West is a hypocritical contradiction, because
Correct.
The West uses human rights or international law while it is allowed to violate that international law against anybody it wants at any time. So the UN can't be a legitimate institution, a truly neutral, human rights oriented institution, as long as we have the United States as this vast empire that is able to violate anything it wants at any time. So that's a huge challenge to that. And that's not to say that we shouldn't have international law and cooperation between states, but that the UN cannot fulfill that role if the United States continues to act as a global empire that dominates and violates other countries' sovereignty.
Well, yeah, and then you have the the right attack that somehow Islamic groups control in the United Nations and push resolutions like Zionism is racism through and so forth. So you have attacks against the UN on both sides. But clearly, I think you make a compelling analysis. I don't disagree with it. I don't see. I don't know what else I can offer. At least, other than what you've suggested in terms of a long-term solution. Without international law, without international human rights, without international institutions, I just don't see the path forward. That we have a very difficult challenge. International law is not a panacea. It never has been. But I will say this: we didn't have a genocide law even 75 years ago. That's something that international law evolved over time, and it's taken time. But we now have a law on genocide, and so
I would
that's how
agree.
international law works. It's
I
very
would agree, but
slow, and
I would add that law and states and government exists in the context of that's the superstructure, the political
correct,
superstructure on top of an economic base, which is
correct,
the base we live under is monopoly capitalism and global imperialism led by the United States and the West. So international law cannot be applied justly and fairly and equally as long as it is a superstructure on top of a base of imperialism. So until the empire is brought down, law
yeah,
cannot be truly applied in a fair way. It's going to always be restricted. Like, as they say in political science, law will not have teeth. There will not be a proper mechanism to enforce the law in a just manner as long as the US has that imperialist control over the world.
right, right, and but again, attacks against international law are also made by the right, these imperialist powers against the power and influence of Islamic radical groups on the United Nations as well.
They're attacking it from the perspective that they think that the US empire should be free to do whatever it wants, that we should not attempt to have any sort of international order whatsoever. I think China has a better approach. China, Xi Jinping, his theory, he calls it win-win cooperation. And that is China's approach to international relations. It's an approach that I think respects sovereignty and uh, economic sovereignty, political, cultural sovereignty of other nations. That's the goal of what the United Nations should be doing. But until we can confront the challenge of Western control over the world, then the UN will not have the power to actually enforce its own laws. To speak to your point, the UN has been attempting to criticize Israel on the settlements, on Gaza, on
Right,
occupation for more than 50 years.
right,
So if the UN had actual strength and power, it could have imposed a solution onto Israel 5 decades ago.
right.
So unfortunately, it is the United States that has vetoed and prevented the United Nations from doing anything about it. So until that United States, US empire is pulled back, I don't see how we can move forward with international law.
Yeah, I would, but as a practical matter, I would say we need a political struggle that supports international law and that promotes the United Nations approach of international law and international human rights as one part of the program.
I agree. I agree. So
Yeah.
it's a good debate over law. I mean, you're a legal scholar, and so I take your
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote my thesis, I was constantly dealing with this question you raise from all sides, and
right, right.
my thesis supervisor always counseled me, just go ahead and develop your ideas about international law and international human rights, and the hell with the debate because it's unsolvable. I mean, international law has evolved and has made progress. And all I can, we have the prosecutions against genocide in Serbia, in former Yugoslavia. We had prosecutions against genocide in Rwanda with jailed Hutu officials, and now we have Netanyahu himself, the leader of Israel, under criminal indictment by the International Criminal Court. I think it's only a matter of time before he gets picked up
Well, I think what I think we're agreeing, but we're saying things in different ways because I think the communists have always supported international law. The Soviet Union was instrumental in supporting the creation of the United Nations after World War II. The Soviet Union wanted to build an international order that respected the sovereignty of all people, which is why they wanted to create the UN and opposed what Hitler had done and what the Nazis had done. But it has been, in my view, the thing that has undermined international law has been the United States and the
right.
West, because the
Yeah.
West wants to preach international law while behaving as an empire. And I don't think empire and law go together, because empire is inherently a lawless thing.
Yeah, that I would completely concur in. The United States has acted ultra vires, outside of international law in its military campaigns around the world, whether it's Vietnam or overthrowing the democratically elected government in Iran, or countless other
Hundreds of interventions.
regime change efforts throughout the world, including the most recent ones, attacks on Ukraine. Most Americans don't know that it was the U.S. that attacked Ukraine, not the Russian Federation in 2014, when we attacked and overthrew the democratically elected Ukrainian government. Why the hell were Americans attacking Ukraine and the sovereignty of Ukraine? We had no business doing that. It was an act of war. In fact, it was a war crime, in my opinion. But it led to this situation, catastrophe that we're currently in Ukraine.
Absolutely. And I think we can connect Ukraine, Gaza, all of these issues are related to the question we always go back to on this podcast about the war machine. The question.
That's right. That's right. And that Trump is smart to make that his sort of one of the centerpiece of his populist movement, as much of a con artist and phony as he is. But he's smart.
I think that's a good summary of our.
I think so too.
We've gone a far-reaching discussion here, from everything from Jewish history to Trump to international law. But it's
let me
conversation.
Go ahead, John.
It's been a great conversation, because these are very complex topics. The issue why Palestine and Israel animates so many people, even people who don't live there, is because this issue touches on everything. It touches on everything else, and that's why it's so important.
It's for students, it would be what you call an outstanding case study, because it really captures all of these issues that we've been discussing today. But I just want to say to our audience that that's the point of the Praxis report, to try to theorize these challenges that exist and provide more than theorization, but a sort of practical solution or steps we can take to not only resolve these problems, but to show a sort of progressive path forward. That's the purpose and nature of the of the Praxis report. So we hope you'll like our report, press your like button. That really helps our what do they call it, algorithms.
Yeah.
And also join the what is it called, the Patreon group, if you'd like to get additional benefits from hearing the Praxis authors theorize on these questions and provide practical solutions to them. And we'll look forward to talking more and seeing you next time.
Peace, y'all.
Peace.